Compared to Season 1, your time to get to level 100 is going to be 40% faster.
Ladies, gentlemen, and Haradrim of all ages, we're now at what is essentially the halfway point of Diablo 4 being on trial in front of the jury of public opinion. Ahead of Season 2 in a couple of weeks, the developers said that they had two 2-hour streams to share with us. A lot of information on changes, and as a couple of hours ago, the first of these two has concluded. We got absolutely just overloaded with information in a good way, so let's break it all down as concisely as I possibly can, and also I'll go into my thoughts on all of this. Does it fix the game? Does it give me any sort of hype or excitement? Where are we at now that we are halfway through the preseason streams for Season 2? First up then, let's talk about the season itself and everything coming with it. Season 1's official release date is October 17th, specifically at 10 AM Pacific time, and the overarching story is the invasion of Lord Zir. This ancient vampire's main goal is to overtake Sanctuary, as for why we'll have to find that out from the story itself. He is invading our game world with legions of vampires, and our main interactable NPC for the seasonal questline is going to be Ares, filling a very similar role to what Corman did in Season 1. She's a vampire hunter, our helpful friend, until, oh no, spoilers, during seasonal story we contract vampirism ourselves, but remain free from the control of Lord Zir. Eris doesn't trust us, but she needs our strength, and that's the story really as far as we know it right now. As far as larger, overarching things then, there will be a number of new dungeons, known as crypts, that we will find throughout the seasonal story. Whether these are repeatable or even added to the Nightmare Dungeon pool, they did not say, but these will likely be similar to Malignant Tunnels. On top of this, the developers say that the end dungeon of the story is very cool, so we'll have to take their word on that for now, and as cool as story is, we have a hell of a lot of mechanical changes and updates to get into here as well. First up are the Vampiric powers themselves. There are going to be 22 Vampiric powers coming with Season 2, and you seem to be able to equip up to 5 of them at a time. The powers themselves have evolving power levels up to level 3 max, and in order to equip a specific power, you need to reach its pact requirements. Packs are those little symbols at the bottom of the equipment, the skull, the trophy, and the whatever the last one is. Each power requires you to have a specific number of specific packs, and in order to have all 5 powers that you want in particular, your gear will need to have the right packs to support it. Gear will randomly roll with some packs already on it, but not the maximum amount, as there are items that you can get to apply specific packs of your choice to your armor. Normally gear will have 3 packs maximum, sacred gear will have 4 maximum, and ancestral will have 5 maximum packs. It's worth noting after the stream we got a blog post with a fair amount more information even than this, with the stars of this first being an item that clears all the packs on an item so you can fully customize which ones are on a piece of gear yourself, removing a lot of the potential RNG we could have had and making the system actually feel quite reasonable. Then secondarily, we just literally had them announce all of the Vampiric powers. They told us what all of them are, so here they are on screen. The heavy hitters are called major powers and require 6 packs to make them work, and they include things like just general lucky hit chance for Vampiric curse application, which we'll talk about in a moment, funky buffs to channeled skills, interesting interactions with overpower, damage over time specific powers, or even Moonrise, which will definitely try to create some builds focusing heavily around using basic skills, which could actually be quite neat. All in all, we will have to see how this actually plays, but it definitely sounds more interesting and expansive than Malignant powers at the very least to start with. Also worth noting that all of these Vampiric powers are designed to be class agnostic, rather instead just being interacting with specific ability types that everyone will have, like your dash skill, or any defensive abilities, or even things that only interact with channeling abilities. Specifically, there is also an overarching mechanic called the Vampiric Cursed. You can apply this to enemies with Vampiric powers, and killing enemies with the curse generates the souls for players. Certain abilities will then consume the souls that you have gotten to boost their powers, which should create some more dynamic gameplay hopefully. As for the items that can be add force packs onto armor, these drop from Bloodseekers, which are the sort of lieutenants of Lord Zir's army, and are supposed to feel like player character classes that have turned, the 5 that we can actually use yourselves, you know? But if they fell to Vampiric powers and then lost their own will fighting for Zir, so that we could create just more interesting fights than the Malignant elites, I suppose. But at the end of the day, these will function a lot like those, dropping important materials for the seasonal mechanic, having the ability to spawn in the overworld or in dungeons, or there are also lures that we'll be able to craft to fight them purposefully. On top of this, there are 2 new monster families being added to the game entirely, which are shadow vampires, meant to have different attacks and animations than normal vampires to add some variety, and also blood skeletons, also different attacks and visuals from normal skeletons. All of these new enemies, and also the Bloodseeker lieutenants, will also spawn in an event called Blood Harvest. This is essentially like a season-specific Helltide variant for all intents and purposes. The area it takes place in rotates around the map, but unlike Helltide, there are no timers in between. There will always be one active. During this event, the area specifically will be overtaken with these seasonal monsters, as well as captured civilians that you can rescue. Interacting with Blood Harvest gets you specific unique materials like lures for the Bloodseekers and Vampiric keys to free the prisoners or open caches. The more activities you do in Blood Harvest, the more Hunter's Acclaim that you will gain, which is a separate reward system that unlocks things like specific powers or equipment and cosmetics as you do more of these. They also predicted us asking what the difference between this and Helltide is, and well, the main answer that they gave us was just that it serves a different purpose. Mechanically though, and how we interact with it, it will be relatively similar, let's be honest. Worth noting as well, Helltide will still be happening. Blood Harvest is not a replacement, it's just a separate, similar event. Then finally, we had talk about Lord Zir, the new boss, being added with this, and he is not only being added for the season, but also going to be one of our new big endgame bosses. On which note, let's switch gears and talk about the new endgame boss system, and also worth noting, everything from this point forward will affect both the seasonal realm and the eternal realm. Here's a chart that they showed to represent the base game player activities, and here's the same chart adjusted for season 2. There are 5 new endgame bosses being added, and the major point of these is that each one will have a heightened chance of dropping specific uniques so that you can target farm them. If you want to target a specific one for your class, you need to target the specific one of the bosses that matches that. Each one is fightable only once you collect the right materials to summon them. Varshan, returning from season 1, will require materials that you get from Whispers of the Dead. Lord Zir, the new boss of season 2, requires materials that you get from Legion events and world bosses. Grégoire, a new lightning-themed boss, requires materials from Helltides. Beast in Ice is summoned using materials dropped in tier 31 and above Nightmare dungeons, and then finally a new big level 100 boss who is actually summoned using materials that are dropped by Varshan and also Grégoire, and that boss is Duriel, King of Maggots. This fight is specifically being listed as well as having a low chance of dropping uber uniques, but that quote-unquote low chance is supposedly much higher than anywhere else, with the dev specifically saying that everyone will likely at least know someone with an uber unique once this change happens. It won't drop every attempt every time you kill it, and not every player will get them incredibly quickly, but you'll definitely know people who do have them on a personal level, rather than just being a major community event whenever one drops for anyone on the globe. It was also stated that the materials for summoning these bosses are tradable, actually, and a good way to double dip is to gather materials with friends and then fight the bosses together. A group of 4 being able to fight the boss 4 times as often as a solo player, and each getting your own rewards. On top of the specific unique target farming and the uber unique drop rates from Duriel as well, each of these bosses has unique cosmetic weapons and armor drops too, unique mounts even for some of them as well, so there are secondary reasons to fight these on top of the previously mentioned ones. Here they also mentioned that quote-unquote nearly every single unique item in the game is getting an update, but I noticed that they didn't use the word buff, they said update, so just keep an eye on that for the stream on the 10th to see what it actually means. They also acknowledged that while they are happy with the addition of these bosses, it is just the start of additions to the endgame for Diablo 4, in large part due to significant experience increases that will be coming across the board. Incense items now grant bonus experience as well, and also persist after death, which means that we'll want to be crafting these for leveling as much as we can as well now too. As well on top of that, experience bonuses in games such as the elixirs, now the incense as well, or the seasonal blessing will all stack multiplicatively with world tier XP bonuses rather than additively, which is actually going to be a much bigger change than it might sound like, and with the other changes being made, they expect the time from level 1 to 100 to decrease by 40%, which is a massive amount, obviously. A big issue that I immediately thought would come up with this is, well, that means more people will hit level 100 a lot faster than they ever did before, and that means the lack of proper endgame content will become glaringly obvious much faster. They said that they are aware of this, but this XP change lets them focus a lot more on adding more endgame specific things because they expect more of the player base to actually reach them and more of the playtime of the community as a whole to actually be there. On top of this, a promised change as well, Scrolls of Escape for hardcore players will now be automatically used on disconnect to keep you alive. They've also changed how skip campaign works, and now when you load into a new character that has skipped the campaigns, you will have 10 unlocked waypoints, 2 in each zone, in an attempt to make that just feel a little bit smoother. As well, all renown rewards now persist across your account, so you never have to think about doing renown again if you don't want to, which is great, but you can also still do strongholds and side quests if you choose to. As well, we are getting 2 new character slots to make space for Season 1 characters moving to Eternal. Then we have a rollback to a change that was made during Season 1. Overworld monsters will no longer be scaled to be below your level. In order to balance this a bit with the difficulty curve that they want, they've also just made crowd control effects across the board in the entire game much less punishing, much lower duration, so general fighting as a whole should be much easier and smoother just in the game. On top of that, we have a really massive change here, which is changes to how the entire loot system works, really. Now monsters will have much tighter item power drop ranges depending on their own level, and the overall maximum item power has increased by a whole 100 up to 920. This means that you shouldn't be able to get a 920 item the second you break into World Tier 4, but rather you have a sense of actual progression as you get up in levels towards 100 and actually get to get the higher item powered items. As well, this extends past level 100 too, with enemies at level 150, which is the max Nightmare Dungeon monster level for the top tier, of course, pretty much only being able to drop 920. So now there is not only a definable reward for the people that were already doing Tier 100 Nightmare Dungeons, but also an actual incentive to do it for the players that otherwise didn't really care. On the note of Nightmare Dungeons, we also got quite a few changes brought up with these. Teleporting to a Nightmare Dungeon will now take you directly inside of the dungeon, rather than requiring a second loading screen to do so, which is quite nice. Dungeon events within the dungeons have had their density increased notably to make them feel more worth doing, and as well, on top of that, NPCs that exist within dungeon events will now properly scale to not just get randomly one-shot and ruin the event for the player. The overall readability of traps in dungeons has been improved, theoretically just meaning that you'll be able to see them easier, and here is where they mention crowd control being better, but they did make a point of saying that it does apply to everything in the game, not just traps. Then they mentioned that Paragon Glyph XP rewards will be increased dramatically, trying to keep it somewhat in line with the expected 40% speed increase to leveling, so that you should still hit level 100 with similar Paragon progress as to what you would have had before these changes. On top of that, we have a few affliction changes as well. Backstabbers now makes monsters apply vulnerable to you when hitting you from behind. Critical resist now makes monsters' attacks apply a debuff to you that reduces your crit damage, rather than just having it reduce the entire time as well. Death Pulse no longer triggers on monsters that already have death explosions, and they've also actually removed overlapping death pulses so you can't just get insta-nuked by multiple dying enemies. Lightning Storm now only actually starts trying to hurt you if you are in combat, and on top of that, if the lightning hits you in the bubble, you'll get a 35% move speed bonus for 5 seconds, and that's a nice change to this affix, but it will still probably be a bit of an irritating one to deal with. Then finally, Drifting Shade's chase duration has been reduced from 5 seconds to 3 seconds, and the respawner increased by 2 seconds on that. On top of that, they have just gone into a handful of dungeons and fully just 100% removed the objectives from them, with the goal now just being to get to the boss and then kill it. This is definitely an interesting prospect, and they are actually using this as a test to see how players feel about it. So, if you like this change, be very vocal about it. If you don't like it, be vocal about that too. Player feedback will decide if this becomes more popular within the other dungeons, or if it will go back. As well, many dungeons have had their layouts reworked to be a bit friendlier in an attempt to further reduce backtracking. Past that, we have changes to towns in general to also make them feel more friendly to players. There is now an occultist at the Tree of Whispers to make it feel like a proper hub. There are now stashes in all towns with waypoints, not only the major ones, and the major towns now have multiple stash access locations, mostly by the major vendors. The Purveyor of Curiosities as well has also in all cases moved closer to the waypoint in their respective town. All of this will hopefully add up to just reduce the time that we have to spend in town, so that is nice to have for sure. We also had full explanations on the changes to the mounts that are coming this season too, starting with some better movement tracking, reducing the frequency that your horse will get stuck on a rock or something like that. The base mount move speed is now increased by 14%, but top speed is unchanged, and the duration of the sprint effect is now 50% longer, which means you should be able to actually loop it pretty effectively without it being on cooldown. Spur also now breaks barricades while active, which is pretty nice too. On top of that, the cooldown from manually dismounting has been lowered to 5 seconds from 10. The cooldown from being forcibly dismounted is now 15 seconds, down from 30. As well, you now only have to wait 3 seconds after mounting instead of 10 to do your dismount attack. We also had changes to some world events, specifically the Legion event spawn timers have been reduced by 5 minutes, so they'll be a little bit more frequent. And also they will now give you a warning 10 minutes before they start instead of 5. This is important, especially as materials from these events will be used for one of the new endgame bosses. As well, this is much bigger in my opinion. World boss spawns will now be every 3.5 hours rather than being every 6, much more frequent, and the warning timer on your map has been increased to 1 hour before the spawn rather than 30 minutes, with a special message that will be broadcast to all players 15 minutes before the spawn happens. This is just solid all around in my mind. Definitely, I like this change. Then we have specific endgame changes, and the big overarching thing here is that Whispers of the Dead is just way better, and we'll definitely be using it. It's way more useful in multiple ways. Firstly, Nightmare Sigils dropped from the Whispers caches will always be within 5 levels of your highest completed Nightmare dungeon on that character, so you won't just be getting random trash sigils, you'll actually be getting things that are relevant. Gold rewards have also been greatly increased from Whispers caches, and they spend about 2 minutes emphasizing this, and it seems to be based on some other information we find out too, that Whispers is now just intended to be your actual gold farming mechanic now, basically, because to skip ahead just a moment, we now will no longer be seeing non-sacred items on World Tier 3 and non-ancestral items in World Tier 4. They will instead just automatically convert into crafting materials on drop so that you pick those up instead of filling your inventory with items that you don't need in minutes. This definitely is weird for the people who would obviously have wanted to sell those items for gold instead of, salvaging them, but we'll see how rewarding the Whispers caches are now, because that is going to change stuff up quite a bit and we need to see the actual numbers. On top of this, they've notably increased the experience rewards for both Whispers cache hand-ins and also Helltide cache openings too as well, to try and make both of these activities feel at least a little bit more worth doing, even if not quite as good as Nightmare Dungeons for experience. As well, both Whisper caches and Helltide caches will fully adhere to the item type that you select, whereas before you only had one item guaranteed of the chosen type, then random rolls after that. As well, Helltide caches will now have unique symbols on the map to tell you what type they are, rather than you having to get close enough to actually find out what's in them. Past that are UI and UX changes. Not all of these are all that important, so I'll be showing the slides on screen so you can see them for yourself. I'll only be actually talking about the really juicy stuff. Stash sorting now groups matching legendary aspects together so that you can compare them to each other nicely, but also on top of that we have a bunch of new filters when looking at the stash, and a text bar search function which is very helpful. Definitely big improvements to your stash across the board here. It's not perfect, but it is definitely a fair bit better. As well, there will be an auto run button added to the game so you can just move around a little bit more comfortably, and also the minimap will be more zoomed out as a whole, just everywhere to let you see more information. Then our final section, items. First is an expected change that we all knew about. Gems no longer drop directly into your inventory, instead dropping as a crafting material that you will put together into proper gems at the jeweler. Enchantment costs have been changed a little bit weirdly. Apparently they wanted to lower the scaling cost increase so that multiple enchantments is cheaper, so they did that, but for some reason they also increased the initial enchantment cost. I don't really get why, but we'll have to see how this actually looks in game before we can properly judge it. We already talked about the item power changes from before as well, but these will be pretty prevalent, so of course they mention them here in quite a bit of detail. As well, worth mentioning, items dropped from a normal Whispers cache will count as being from monsters that are 5 levels above the player. The enhanced Whispers caches will now count as being from monsters 10 levels above the player, and Helltide caches will also count as being from monsters 10 levels above the player. This should make Helltide and Whispers gear actually much more worth gathering in general. Also worth noting, they mentioned that the new endgame bosses will have enhanced drop pool rates compared to same level content as well, with Duriel specifically having a tighter item power drop range than normal level 100 content. Also worth noting that Uber Uniques starting in Season 2 will not only always drop at the new item power cap of 920, but also starting now they will always have maxed out affixes. There is no longer any such thing as a badly rolled Shaco. If you get a Shaco, you get a Shaco, and it exactly is as strong as any other player Shaco could ever be. Past this, they mentioned Smoldering Ashes will be moved to earlier Battle Pass tiers as well, so that you can access them earlier if you level fast enough, which is expected now. And then we also had confirmation in the question and answer section that they plan to release 6 new uniques with Season 2, just like they did with Season 1, so expect 1 new unique per class and 1 new Uber unique as well. And that just about covers it for this stream then. We also were told what to expect with the follow-up stream coming next week on October 10th, where they'll be doing a deep dive on the resistance updates, the damage bucket changes to things like critical, vulnerable, and overpower, updates to the classes in general of course, updates to uniques and legendaries of which they have promised quite a lot, and then another question and answer section 2, along with the release of the full patch notes after the stream ends. On top of that though, they will also be starting the discussion about some of the changes that are planned for patch 1.2.1, which will happen a little bit into Season 2. They also made a point multiple times to say that there would be new info at BlizzCon, which we should look at, and that's not going to be until the start of November, so I wouldn't be surprised if this is actually where they'll be announcing the first expansion for the game that I would expect to be hitting next year, so that's just entirely possible. With all that then, where do we stand? Obviously we still have that second stream that I just mentioned will be full of a lot more information, but what we learned today, with that, what is Season 2 shaping up to be? Will this be the savior that Diablo 4 needed to bring it back to the limelight, to bring back all of the lost players and regain the hype it had on release? Was this the opposite? Was this a terrible showing that killed the interest even for the small amount of remaining players? Well, in my opinion, it's neither of those. It is instead firmly somewhere in the middle. There were a lot of good things announced, a lot of changes, and none of them struck me as just being purely bad, though a couple of them I'll have to see in game before I have a proper judgment for them. Simultaneously though, they didn't fix all the problems by any means. They didn't make the game feel a lot better just instantly. They've made a good dent though. They've shown progress in a positive direction, but it doesn't alleviate all the issues by any means. In other words, I think right now we're in a sort of middling position from this. The people who are on the fence about playing Season 2 will probably give it a try, unless next week's stream is a disaster of course, but this is definitely not bringing back the people who fully quit, who have completely given up. And I also don't think it will cause anyone to quit who otherwise was happy to play the game, so yeah, middling is about how I would put it. Maybe a slight dip in a positive direction at the most, but the consistency of changes being good is what will be required for the game to still be relevant in a few months' time. It's not just one good stream with one good set of information, they need to be consistent, and that stream next week will be another big moment and deciding factor, as it will be what truly makes a lot of people choose whether or not they'll be coming back for Season 2. With that then, I'll leave you all to process this just ridiculous truckload of information and form your own opinions on it, of course. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Do you agree with me, or do you think this is a lot better or worse than I do? Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and until next time, ladies and gentlemen, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.